Jon Rappaport is with us. Jon is on the line. Jon offers it just makes so much sense when you read what he's got going on there after taking in some of the mainstream media. Jon, I find very funny when he takes something from mainstream media that's absolutely ridiculous, and then he's been known to do a parody of that and make an equally alarming story, or even more so, and then people that are mad that he's writing this because they don't get that he's being sarcastic. But Jon is a hell of a researcher. He has a lot of information, and he is in California. Jon, how are you?
Very good.
I wanted to have you on the show because we had a great time with you last summer and a lot of great information. And we talked a little bit at the end of that episode of your, I don't know, is it a life work? The Matrix, Exit from the Matrix, the works that you have done that are basically self-improvement courses and imagination awareness courses and unlimited potential. But you have a very different, this isn't like Anthony Robbins or some kind of strange huckster. You've got solid, logical, and a course on logic. And I really think it would do the listeners a great service to hear much more about the individual segments within your two great learning tools, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So
the first collection, these are both huge, but the first one is called The Matrix Revealed. And people can read the breakdown of everything that's in it at my site, nomorefakenews.com. There is a section of many, many interviews that I did with an insider whose pseudonym is Ellis Medavoy. He was a propaganda operative, very high level, who worked for elites behind the scenes, certain members of the Council on Foreign Relations and other medical groups. And we met at a point where I was still working on my first book in 1988 called AIDS, Inc. And he said to me, "You're on the right track. I can tell you that because I was in charge of a lot of propaganda that was being floated around the world about AIDS. Keep going." And then sometime later we connected again. We began to talk in depth. I vetted him to the nth degree to make sure that he was indeed who he says he was, and when I was satisfied, I said, "Look, how about we do some interviews off the record? In other words, I don't expose who you are, and I'll take down everything you say and print it in my newsletter." And he said, "Okay, let's try it." Well, this led to, all told, maybe 50 or 60 long conversations, some of which are in The Matrix Revealed. What's different about Ellis is he describes the nuts and bolts of how the people who run this world create reality for everybody else, not just in general vague terms, but in very sophisticated terms, and how they operate with reporters, how they operate with editors, how they operate with all kinds of media outlets, but also on a psychological level of mind control, how he views the public mind and how it can be manipulated in terms of rhythms, frequencies, pace, which words flow in which way, altering people's sense of time as they either read or listen or watch reports about what's going on in the world. Extremely profound stuff that I had never encountered from anybody before. And I got much more involved and engrossed and interested as these interviews went on and on and on. So many of those interviews are reproduced in The Matrix Revealed. And the reason that I put them there is because rather than trying to frighten people into feeling that there is no hope, what Medavoy offers is, in a sense, look, here is how we build reality for you. Here's how it's really done. We're the painters, so to speak, we're the movie makers, we're the directors and the producers of the stage play called reality. And this is how we put it on, and this is how we rope you in. The implication, which he was very aware of, was that the individual is completely capable of creating reality as well for himself or herself. If you understand how reality is being created for you, you have a much better chance of creating the reality that you want. And since he reformed himself and realized that he was off on a course of extreme evil and retired, he wanted to somehow expose this in some way as to what he was doing with that hope in mind. That makes up one mega section of The Matrix Revealed.
Okay, John, let me ask you, when you say you vetted Ellis, and I've read a lot of this stuff already, it's really amazing. What did you find out about him? I mean, without giving anything away that you have a trust, perhaps, but I mean, what was he? Was he an interloper who was kind of a bit of a spy for the Illuminati, or was he a willing participant? And what kind of...
Oh, no, he was a willing participant. I mean, he was a hired gun. That was his work, his life's work. He was quite happy to be doing it at one point or for a long time, because he had such a low opinion of the human race that he felt that the only way that the world could survive is if populations were put under extreme control. That was his dedication to that mission. One of the ways that he functioned was, as he described it to me in great detail, he said, "I rarely talk to reporters, but I know who their reliable sources are." He's now talking about big-time mainstream reporters. He said, "I deal with their reliable sources, and I nudge them and move them, these reliable sources, over into seeing things my way, into taking a certain position on key issues like what is the medical cartel really doing to people, what about globalism, what is it, where is it really going, et cetera, on the major issues of our time." He said, "I influence reliable sources in different ways so that when reporters contact them, then these reliable sources feed the reporters the information that I want them to feed them." So he was like 2 levels at least removed from the scene, and he had a very accurate picture of the way mass media work. And so he was able to change, alter, transform all sorts of stories into exactly the way his handlers wanted him to. But he worked as an independent. He would receive an assignment. Okay, here we go. We want to present a certain view about AIDS or about globalism. And this is the bottom line that we want people to believe.
Or global warming or climate change or
any
carbon
of those
footprints.
kinds of subjects, yeah.
Sure.
He did tend to specialize in science, but not only science. And go, do it. And he would do it. And he would be on a handsome budget, and he would have free reign, and he had other people that worked for him. And his job was to make things happen. And he did. And in fact, he would sometimes see how a story that was counter to the vision that he wanted to present was starting to break out in major media. One of his jobs was to put out fires, to discredit people who were starting to appear more influential than he wanted them to be. And one of those people was Dr. Peter Duesberg, who worked at UC Berkeley, who had written a very compelling piece in 1987 in which he stated, "There is no reason to believe that HIV causes AIDS." This would have upset the global apple cart on a whole agenda having to do with AIDS. That's I could talk about for 3 hours. And so Medavoy's job became, I've got to make sure that this guy Duesberg is totally discredited, is made to look like a complete conspiracy theorist, a wacko, a crazy, that nobody will listen to. And in fact, that's exactly what happened to Duesberg. His lab was taken away from him at UC Berkeley. He was renowned as one of the great molecular biologists in the world, and eventually it all came to students are advised not to study with Duesberg because this could taint their later careers. This is how he operated. Duesberg was saying there's no reason to believe that HIV causes AIDS.
Sure.
AIDS is something else entirely. And once you open up that can of worms, which I did in my book, then you begin to see what the real agenda of AIDS and HIV is. Just to give you a brief example, there are various methods, but one of them is they appeal to a primary target's ego. I'm now talking about a researcher, for example. There were a few researchers who were extremely well-funded in the early 80s to come up with what's causing AIDS. In order to come up with that answer, HIV, they had to be lying through their teeth and cheating and faking research and doing all kinds of just criminal stuff. But the payoff was that whoever got to the finish line first and had his conclusions accepted, mainly by the government, would stand to make millions of dollars, celebrated around the world, enormous prestige, et cetera, et cetera. These people were kind of preyed on, you might say, but in a sort of a positive way, like, look, You've got to get to the finish line here. What kind of research do you have that looks promising? Oh, well, I don't know. I've got this, but it's not really conclusive. No. You don't understand. If you don't forward your research, somebody else is going to get there first. So let's have a conversation. Let's sit down and talk about this, And eventually, that person, that scientist, would be won over. And he would say, the hell with it. This is as good as anybody's going to do, or he would rationalize it somehow to himself. And then all of a sudden, you had Luc Montagnier in Paris and Robert Gallo at the National Cancer Institute saying, we found the cause of AIDS. And then you had a press conference on television. No conclusive research ever published on the subject, where the United States government essentially rubber-stamped that in 1984 and said that the cause of AIDS has been found. And then overnight, all the funding for all the research on the question of what causes AIDS was completely canceled and dried up, so that if you weren't now looking into how HIV causes AIDS, you were out in the cold. You couldn't get any money for research. It was all a prop job. It was totally manipulated from start to finish. That's how it happened.
Wow. Okay. And again, Ellis, was this like an NSA operation? Or
Ellis Medavoy.
Yeah, was it NSA, CIA?
Primary operative in the field of trying to convince and successfully convince the planet that all you had to think about when you said AIDS was HIV.
Yeah.
AIDS, HIV, AIDS. They're synonymous. To weld that into the public consciousness, the government consciousness, the scientific research consciousness, the media consciousness, so that nobody could doubt it. And if anybody did, he would be called liar, conspiracy, lunatic, wacko, crazy, whatever.
Yeah. It's pretty difficult to round up people who are accurate in their calling them on this, such as yourself, and the very little relatively exposure that you get. It's not like no one knows they're up to this stuff, but just everybody doesn't want to believe it, I guess. There's a Super Bowl to watch or a Grammy to follow or something. Yeah,
well, this is especially on a question where everybody seems to be totally in agreement, and it becomes entirely politically incorrect to disagree. Like HIV and AIDS. I mean, you're not just talking about some little issue here. This is like a $1 trillion issue, and there's all kinds of social agendas connected with it and politically correct things to say. He was one of the guys that was key in making all that happen, and also making it very difficult, if not impossible, for anybody with a counter-opinion to get into the mainstream with it. It's gigantic when you back up and look at it. And when I did, it took me a couple of days to really come to terms with it, that this could be one of these gigantic propaganda operations. And Ellis told me the nuts and the bolts of the whole deal and how he did it and what he did. That would just absolutely hypnotize everybody. So basically he was offering you a deathbed confession type of thing? Or in a sense, many of like them? Like a reformed drunk. I'm not doing this anymore. I've retired. I'm out of the game. I'm not telling, nobody can know my name, but here's how you do it. Yeah, here's how it's done. This is particularly insightful, rare information. So that's just merely one sliver of one component of your information. Yeah. In the Matrix Revealed. In the Matrix Revealed. So, okay, so Ellis has some great deep insights for us. And I wanted to ask you specifically about that. The concept of we all make our own world, we create our own world. The way I see it, I guess I've created a bit of a mess. Seems like I got a lot of problems all over my little planet here. If it's true that we're making our own way and things are very problematic with war and a lot of the geopolitical stress, is that because we're just doing a poor job of collectively imagining a better place to live? Yes, but also it isn't just imagining it. I'm not selling some little trick of manifestation where you snap your fingers and everything changes. This is about living a completely different kind of life. If a person begins to live through and by imagination and creative force, then he is going to develop a vision that's very powerful about what he most profoundly desires. And then he is going to work to make that into fact in the world. And if you have a number of people doing this, it becomes extremely strong. It's not just sitting there meditating on something or thinking in a different way, but it starts with understanding that everything that we've been taught about psychology and the way the psychology of the human mind operates is either completely false or is only based on the ideas of Pavlov, which are the conditioned reflex. Something happens to you and then you do this. Something else happens and then you do that. That is completely irrelevant to what I'm talking about, because way more powerful than that could ever be is the creative force of the individual. But the individual has to be able to get himself together to live through and by imagination and find that vision of what he most profoundly desires and then commit himself to making it happen in the world. I give people tools for understanding and tools for practice so that people can actually dig into this. But in the second mega collection called Exit from the Matrix, there are between 50 and 100 imagination exercises which I've developed and describe in full to people that they can do on a daily basis so that their imagination becomes that much more powerful. Their creative power becomes that much more strong and successful and useful, so that they now begin to realize that they've been living on some other dimension of themselves rather than at the highest level of their own creative power. And when they inhabit that higher level on a consistent basis, everything changes.
And people will even notice that in you, in the way you govern yourself and relate to others.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
That's going to be huge.
Yeah, it isn't anything that you can avoid. We're going to say, it's sort of like, to use a crass metaphor, you used to pull up to their house in a broken-down wreck, and now you're driving the kind of car that does 600 miles on salt flats in the desert. And they come out the front door, and they say, wow, what the hell happened? Yeah, they're going to notice for sure. They're going to notice quite definitely. And some people will not enjoy that because it points out to them their own deficiencies, you might say, or their own refusal to do that for themselves.
Yeah, well, when you put a constructive reality together that eventually through other data input you realize, wow, I'm way off track here, that kind of thing. Yeah,
way off track. In fact, I'll tell you a quick anecdote about that.
Jon, this is amazing to me because not only from what I've seen so far, what I've seen of it and read about it, you have an 18-lesson course in something that should be available at any self-respecting school, and that is a course in logic and analysis. Can you tell us what logic and analysis is? Why do you feel the need to offer a logic and analysis course? Is it because no one really seems to operate on those tenets anymore?
Yeah, that's the best reason I can think of.
Okay.
When you're dealing with the world of events that we see around us and the tons and floods of information around that, it can become like a labyrinth, a maze, to try to analyze information. And when people go to school these days, they certainly don't learn logic. And that prevents them from being able to see what a line of reasoning or thought is. In fact, I just put out a piece about that today. More or less, this is the way people go these days. They look at the whole sea of information, and they believe that they're entitled to just, I'm going to plug into it anywhere I want to, and then whatever my reaction seems to be, that's what I'm going to give voice to. That's what I'm going to say. It's kind of like a supermarket, and I just pick products off the shelves whenever I feel like it, and I throw them into my cart. And then if I wind up getting sick because there's too many chemicals and sugar and crap in these, I don't even know about that. I don't want to know about it. Forget it. Logic is the way a line of reasoning works. It either works correctly or not. It's either what they call valid or invalid. And by understanding some of those principles and working with examples in this course, a person gets to become much more familiar with actually analyzing an article, a report, a book, a video, or whatever, can say, wait a minute here, hold on a second. There's a flaw there. There's another one over there. It's about finding mistakes and flaws.
Here's one thing where I find that all the time, and I found it very prevalent when George Bush was in office. There would be a tape that would turn up somewhere, purportedly from Osama bin Laden, whichever photographic representation of him you fancy, however you want to match them up. And they would always say, like the headline in the newspaper would be, CIA finds another bin Laden tape, or new bin Laden tape threatens West, or something of that nature. And then within the story, not even being debunked from elsewhere, within the story, it would say, near the end of the story, like 15 paragraphs in, it would say, the source of the tape and the person on the tape have not been verified up to CIA standards. Or whatever. And it's like the exact opposite of what the headline was. Of course, people only read the headline in the first few paragraphs, and they're on their way, completely misinformed.
Yeah, that's exactly, that's one of the most gross examples that you can find, but it pops up all the time. Got to have a headline that's going to catch the attention, and then the story goes in a different direction.
Yeah.
And the vast bulk of people are not aware of this, not aware of that at all. And that's just the most gross example of non-logic. But you can get down into more nuanced and subtle variations on themes and so forth. And when you do, you find out that a lot of the information that you've been sucking up has no basis at all, absolutely none. And people need to be armed with this kind of a training, which normally in a sane world would happen in school, but it doesn't, so that they can analyze information and they can get down to the bottom of things and understand why they're either accepting or rejecting certain things.
I think people really, it should be a basic thing in school. Obviously, school, the notion that I have of what school should be, not the PSs all over the place that are just cramming the diktats down everyone's throat.
And I can tell you that it's not there in schools on purpose.
Well, it has to be.
What happens is if a person is armed with this kind of knowledge and understanding, they start to become quite independent. They become independent in school. They become independent out of school, all over the place. And that is not the kind of society that is being built for us. And I can attest to that myself from my own experience, because it wasn't until college that I actually took a couple of courses in logic from an excellent teacher who was merciless. And so I became a complete pain in the ass in school, in college, because in other classes I would say, wait a minute, I just want to review what you just said, the last couple of things there. And people began looking at me askance, like, this is not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to be able to point out that I got from A to B through some surreptitious, bogus way. But that's good. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make people who are independent, who don't care so much about what other people think, because they can actually analyze things themselves, and that's what logic does for you.
And then you find yourself doing that all the time now, I guess, John. You just treat everything like that naturally without thinking about it. Yeah.
You can turn it on and off. It's not something that becomes an obsession. It's not that you are screaming at everybody all day or anything like that, because you don't have to. You know the difference between being in a social situation, for example, and actually trying to analyze information. You know the difference between having a conversation at a party with 6 other people, half of whom are already drunk, and actually reading a book and making notes because you want to write something about it or you want to be able to understand a certain key issue. That's one of the great things about it. It's a tool. You can use it when you want to, and you can put it away in the garage when you don't want to.
And you've got some other great interviews with some other people. I don't know how you came across these folks, but you've had a long career, but you've really lined up the Mindwork All-Stars. You've got Jack True, which I don't believe that is his real name either. Is that right?
It's his professional name.
Okay.
And he did, in fact, use it for many years as a hypnotherapist.
Okay, why is he so important, and what are the main understandings that he puts forward that you decided to offer in your package there?
Jack and I met in the late 80s while I was looking around to write my first book, and he was instrumental in getting me a contract with a publisher to write AIDS Inc. And then we began talking, and then I saw that this was going way beyond any of that. Jack was, to me, the most innovative hypnotherapist in the world, who eventually gave up doing hypnotherapy because, as he told me, the new patients walking in my door are already hypnotized. So my job is to unhypnotize them, and that was the basis of his most profound research. And we collided because I had been writing fiction, painting for many years, and so I was already aware of the changes in my life that had happened through imagination, creative power, and so on. And what Jack was doing with his patients was he was getting them to access their sleeping imagination. I mean, if I had to put it in a nutshell, that's what he was doing. And he found marvelous and ingenious ways of doing that, and people's lives changed enormously as a result of that. It's as if this is really the landscape of consciousness. Jack would say, look, there's a part of your consciousness where you're just sort of thinking ordinary thoughts, and you are living your life, and you agree with this, you disagree with that. There's a certain amount of automatic reaction that's taking place and whatever. But there's another whole layer above that, which is enormous and unlimited, where you could be creative and you could be tapping in and accessing your imagination. But the problem is that for most people, they don't want to go there. They don't really want to know what that is. So they build a wall between those two parts of their consciousness.
Why do we do that? Okay, we're going to spend a little time now talking about the other package, but in the first package, I've just realized that I can find no logical reason not to get better at analysis. Here's a few headings on your website. I just wanted to spend a bit of time on those because they're kind of out there, but I don't. Your power revealed and universes without end. So those are two different headings, but I wanted you to talk about that. And of course, you also have relationships. So I hope both people are expanding their minds in this way, or you're probably not going to relate to your spouse very well after you leave them in the dust with this. But as far as your power revealed, this is something like you're just explaining to us that we've been layered over with nonsense, and you're showing us how to peel it back. Is that pretty close?
Yeah, and it's similar to what I've been saying here, but I go into it in much greater depth. Because historically, we have to realize that everything on this planet, in terms of society and civilization, has been lined up so that the individual is going to believe that he has less and less power. So it's also stripping away those layers as well as the personal layers that a person actually puts there to keep himself from having more and more and more power. Because let's face it, a lot of people, if you presented them with that possibility, would recoil. They would say, well, I don't know. I mean, there's going to be a certain place here where if I had more and more and yet even more power, I'm going to step back from that because that could be a bad thing. Yeah, where did that idea come from?
Well, that's got to be great for those that govern.
Yeah, and the person also has his own internal apprehensions about what would happen if I had more power. So it's sort of it's internal and it's external. It's what elites are doing on this planet and have been doing in one form or another forever, and it's what individuals have been doing to themselves, all of which ends up with severely limiting power of the individual. That's a shorthand version of what's in that particular seminar. And then to get to really upper levels of all of this, where you're really reaching way out there, but I've seen it happen, I've experienced it myself. At a certain point, when one is really making their most profound vision come true in the world, certain synchronicities, paranormal experiences begin to happen. They just do, because that person is now exceeding the whole landscape of the average, the normal, which is really the subnormal. He's going beyond that. And when that happens, certain kinds of experiences are going to occur, like being able to read somebody else's thoughts, know what's going to happen in the future, being able to, in some cases, which I've seen, affect people at a distance. And I'm not talking about to try to do bad things to them. I'm talking about just the opposite, to actually bring people up out of where they have sunk down to. Experiences like that happen without a word, without a conversation, being able to do that by creating the space or the rhythm or the frequency in which that happens for somebody else.
Seems like our daily lives are pretty well designed to counter against that at every turn. I mean, you have to take a physical effort to make sure you can get into that zone.
Yeah, I'm saying that somebody who, I'll give an example of a client who says to me, okay, so we've been working together for a little while now, and then I went away, and now I'm back, and I'm just doing the thing that I most want to in my life. I finally discovered / admitted to myself what that is, and that's my vision. And it's big. It's not little. It's not like I want to paint my nails blue instead of red. This is big. And I'm living through and by my imagination to make this happen in the world, to actually fulfill it and make it happen. And as I've been doing that, more and more and more and more and more, I find these extraordinary things are happening.
Well, Jon, that is where we're going to have to leave it. So that's a good place, don't you think?
Yeah, that's a great place.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. We're thrilled to have Jon back, and obviously we're going to have him back later because I'm going to be diving into some of this stuff personally, and I want to discuss my results with you, the audience, and with Jon. Thanks, Jon, for coming on.
Absolutely, Alan. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park.